Okay, so I'm here with Irish Solicitor Stephen Kirwan. He's our guest speaker for today. We're very pleased to have him. Stephen practices immigration law and I believe other types of law as well in Ireland. And of course, Ireland is a different legal system, of course. So we're going to hear a little bit more. We're going to hear a little bit from Stephen about how they do things over there. And we're going to compare some aspects of Irish immigration law with what we have here in the United States. So first of all, welcome, Stephen.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. It's an honour and a pleasure to be able to speak to your students today. And look, hopefully we can have some fun while we're talking about the ins and outs of immigration law, yeah?
Absolutely, absolutely. So before we get into immigration law, let's know a little bit about the man. So can you just tell us about your background? Where were you born? What's your personal background? And then your professional background in education?
Great. So I'm actually I'm American too. Like most of your students, I was born in Boston, Mass, in 1989, and was born to two Irish parents who were living and working in Boston at the time. Again, like most Irish immigrants, as the boom started to kick off in Ireland in the 90s, as tech companies were starting to spring up all over the place, my parents decided to relocate, and I've been here ever since. So I did my undergraduate degree in Trinity College Dublin, and our professional training works a little bit different, but as it happened, I wanted to go down the academic route, and I got accepted onto the PhD program in Trinity College, studying international law and international legal philosophy. I went to a talk by my current boss, maybe 2 years into that, and I was invited to come to the office to do like a training period for a couple of weeks, and I've never left. I literally went from working in the dusty file room to now running the immigration department in our firm, which is the largest in the country, and we have the largest legal aid, which is, again, we'll explain that in a few minutes, but basically kind of free legal aid system as well. And we're growing year on year. We also run a very exciting litigation practice, so where we would, sue the state, and we would take on public bodies in relation to issues of public interest law, which I know is very different for you guys stateside. When we talk about public interest cases and public interest law, really we're representing the little guy. It's not class action suits like you would have. They're actually prohibited in Irish law. So I suppose that's a brief summary of kind of where I come from and maybe my qualifications. But
Wonderful.
As I say, it's pretty basic. I'm a standard guy. I know what I like and kind of just went for it. So.
Nice. So I want to unpack a little bit about what you said. So one point, first of all, that's really interesting for those of us that come from the American legal system is you guys over there, as far as attorneys are concerned, you kind of have a split a little bit in your career practice. You go to law school here, typically, although you could go the Kim Kardashian route and be an apprentice, but most lawyers here go to law school and then you become a lawyer. We prepare the documents, we prepare the research, and then if there's court to be had, we also go and argue in court. How is it there in Ireland, and how is it different from
So we're a pure common law system based on the British tradition. So again, I think a lot of your students will probably know about the very fractured history and the former colonial status that we had here in Ireland. And obviously there was a partition of our country as well in the 1920s. It's actually the 100th anniversary of the partition this week. So there's a lot of again, your students probably know from reading Irish media. If they Google it, they'll see that our president refused to attend the centenary celebrations of partition because, again, it's a very sore subject, particularly from what happened. And I know a lot of your students will be familiar with the idea of the common law system, which is based on precedent and based on judges passing down rulings from generation to generation, and ultimately that it's not just what the legislator says goes, that there's a constitutional tradition and judges are able to interpret that. So in terms of the profession, absolutely, it's very different here, and we're very similar to England and to Australia and to New Zealand. We have, on Canada actually for that matter, we would have, the Canada is slightly different, but most of those common law countries, we split the profession into two. So we have solicitors and we have barristers. Now, in reality, the difference used to be that barristers were your advocates. They weren't your Robert Kardashians, put it that way. They were more like the advocates, the ones with the style, the
Johnny
people
Cochran's.
I was just trying to think of his name and I couldn't remember, but the Johnny Cochrans, that's exactly it, who would present cases of, constitutional importance before the higher courts. So in Ireland, we would have the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court. So that's kind of our higher court structure. Solicitors, as a general rule, or traditionally, would have only advocated in front of local courts, so courts of local jurisdiction. And again, to give an American comparison, again, they wouldn't really argue in federal court. They would attend. Basically, the idea would be that barristers can't advertise publicly for their job, right? So what happens is they come to me as a solicitor, and what I do is I take the instructions from the client. I'll do the initial advices on a case. Sometimes I'll help them before local courts or before, local tribunals. And then if I spot a legal point and I think, God, I'd like to challenge that, I often bring in outside counsel. So again, that's what their job would be to do. But those lines are merging all the time, and there's dynamics between practices and between legal professionals now. But the biggest distinction is that barristers, okay, that we've mentioned, that split in the profession, counsel as we call them, they're self-employed. So again, I'm an employee of KOD Lyons Solicitors. That's how solicitors generally work it, that they're employed for someone. Now, there are sole practitioners, don't get me wrong, but it's not really the way it's done. And whereas barristers have to be self-employed. And as I say, their focus is more on high advocacy, or that was the traditional distinction. But again, in the 21st century, we're starting to see a shift away from that. There's, solicitors now who advocate in front of all courts. And barristers similarly who advocate in front of local courts, so it's a bit of a mix, but that is the traditional barrier. And then, like, if I'm involved in those higher cases, I'm not doing the oral advocacy, I'm doing the trial preparation. I'm doing the reading of the precedent, preparing booklets of pleadings and authorities, helping to proofread, taking notes, mainly looking after client care would be another major part of my role. But whereas the barristers are all about the standing up in court and trying to argue their case. So I hope that's an understandable distinction.
Absolutely. Quick follow-up question. Are solicitors in Ireland barred legally from doing oral advocacy in, let's say, the higher level courts?
No, in fact, I was only in the High Court last month. In fact, It was the last time I was arguing. So we can do it. It's unusual because of the way the system is structured, or traditionally. But as I say, those barriers are breaking down. And yes, it is possible. No, we're not barred at all. But it is kind of strange. You don't see it because you know yourself as a practitioner, Parviz, like dealing with cases. It can be very hard to deal with something from the start to the finish. It can take an awful lot of time, an awful lot of manpower, and it's hard to be everything to all people. Right. So that's the other reason why the split works very well for us in Ireland, because we can split, into defined roles when it comes to cases where I look after client care, paperwork, making sure paperwork is filed, proofreading, assisting in maybe reading some of the precedents to make sure that we have everything covered, and leaving the advocacy to the advocates. Right. So that's the cleaner break, but there's no bar.
And in fact, so in the United States, obviously we have an enormous complex legal system. We also kind of have a little bit of a split in expertise, but it's just informal. So in practices in which there's litigation, okay, what we end up having, for example, take personal injury or let's say employment law, we often have firms that deal with the cases in the beginning, maybe of what we call filing of a complaint, the starting of litigation. But because trial advocacy in particular, not just oral argument at hearings, but trial advocacy is such a technical kind of niche skill, very often those firms, they don't handle the actual trial. If the case goes to trial, which in the United States, the vast majority do not, 98% do not, they actually very often bring in outside counsel or possibly even refer the case to counsel that is specialized in trial advocacy. So, it's not a formal split like you guys have here, but we do kind of have that here because, as you said, the law is so complex. Even in one area of law, there's so many different subsets that it can be difficult, as you say, to be all things to all people.
Yeah,
That's an
and
excellent.
I think that's a much better way to be fair. I think if we're comparing the systems,
Mhm.
I feel very sorry for some of my colleagues at the bar. Okay, it's terrible for them now, and they're finding it very hard to get those chances. Because again, solicitors now and the quality of training that's there and the amount of people that are qualifying and the fact that we, as I say, we employ a taxi rank principle where really you're supposed to take what comes in. They can't. Their hands are completely tied. I have to instruct them
Right.
to take a case on, and it is a very very difficult existence in the first 5 to 10 years. They reckon you don't make very much,
Wow.
but you work really hard and you work
Wow.
7 days a week if you're in that line of work. Yeah.
That's quite the combo. Don't make too much, but yet work a lot. Um,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So one last quick question about this, and then we'll move on from this point. Do you reckon in 20 to 30 years that distinction is going to be obliterated in Ireland between barrister and solicitor?
Yeah, so the problem is that it's been a political football for a long time. And like, again, any of your students can read. So when we call them the Troika, but the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, we had a massive banking collapse in 2008, 2009, 2010.
Hmm.
And like, a great sense of national embarrassment that the IMF, who are normally dealing with,
Hmm.
third world countries, were coming to our shores. But one of the big elephants in the room was legal reform and the fact that law is costing so much because,
Hmm.
again, sometimes people just want a trial advocacy expert. That's what they want. They don't want to come to me to get that advice. And that's fine. I mean, that, makes sense because certain needs will depend. And, there was a lot of talk about legal reform and cost reform. But unfortunately, the merging of the professions is not something that has ever been really, it comes up every 5 years and it sits in a report and no one does anything.
Gotcha.
And I think it's a pity because I think who in this game, solicitors are good. Our profession is well regulated. We regulate the numbers very well. So there's always a good demand for our service and it's hard enough to qualify.
Hmm.
The problem with the bar is they're very undersubscribed, but the guys at the top are making an awful lot of money, whereas people at the bottom are struggling to make ends meet. So I would love for it to happen. I just, it's going to take a lot of political will to happen. And that is the problem.
Okay, and I actually lied. I'm going to ask one more question because I'm curious about this point. Is there anybody that's both a solicitor and barrister?
So you can't be both, but you can convert. So
Okay.
after 3 years, so for me to become a barrister, I have to have been practicing 3 years, and then I have to do a very short conversion course.
Okay.
And they do what's called deviling, right? It's a very funny phrase, but
Hmm.
basically where you would shadow basically someone, a more senior barrister.
Hmm.
You can still take on your own work, but it's rare that a devil would take on a lot of, good stuff. They'd
Okay.
normally be traipsing around the local court earning €25 a day,
Oh,
kind of
geez.
work. Yeah,
That's
it's not
rough.
great. Yeah, it's
Okay.
really, really tough for them. So yes, it's possible, but what we're starting to see is it coming the other way. That a lot of people who were training as barristers in the beginning are now trying to come here and swap over and become
Got you.
solicitors.
Got you. Okay.
Yeah.
One other point that I just want to dig a little bit more deep in is the difference in the legal education path to becoming a lawyer. Because every year in our class, we get students that are interested, some that are hardcore, they know they want to go to law school, others that are not so sure. So in the United States, we have basically a system. As I mentioned before, the vast majority of lawyers go get a bachelor's degree, okay, which is basically post high school. We call it a 4-year degree, although plenty of people do it in 5 years now. And then they apply for law school, okay, for a Juris Doctorate degree, okay, which again is typically 3 years, but we also have part-time programs that are 4 years. So you end up getting a 4-year degree after high school, okay, and then you can apply straight away, or you can take some time off and work or whatever, and then you get a 3-year degree, okay, Juris Doctorate degree. You graduate. You pick a state to take a bar exam in. Okay, you take that exam. You typically wait a few months, and then if you pass, you can swear in. Okay, I want to know just a little bit, just very brief, Stephen, from the time that somebody goes to undergraduate, the equivalent of undergraduate over there, what's the path like for them to become a lawyer, to become either a
Sure.
barrister or a solicitor?
Yeah, and I'll give you, what I'll do is, I mean, they're quite similar paths, but I'll divide them up, okay? So, as a solicitor, okay, so the society that regulates us is the Law Society of Ireland, okay? And what they say is, look, the typical route, and I suppose let's just give the typical route. What they say is to qualify to sit professional exams, right? You need to have an undergraduate degree. So that's the first thing. But it can be in anything. It can be, and I know the New York bar is quite similar. My understanding is you can have a degree in like marine biology. It doesn't make a difference.
You can have a degree over here in basket weaving. Doesn't matter.
Exactly. And it's the same here. So basically you do that. And then what you have to do is you have to pass, there was a Supreme Court case years ago, right? That basically once you did a law degree, they used to say you can practice pretty much straight away. Okay, there was no barriers at all. Then they brought in a thing where they said, well, you can have a law degree and then you have to do a professional training course for a year, but then you can do what you like. They've changed that completely because of this Supreme Court case. They said it was very unfair. I can't even remember the name of it. It's that old. But basically, they said it was very, very unfair. So what is now the system is you get your undergraduate degree. You then sit a set of exams. They call them the final examinations, but they're far from the final examinations. But they call them the final examinations or FE1s, okay? And you have to do 8 of those. And they're in a variety of areas, but like constitutional law, contract, civil law, so tort, there's EU law, company law, equity, which I don't know, you probably don't have in the States, but it's basically about like when someone does something really bad and we don't have law, common law to fill the gaps in, how can the law make up rules to make sure that justice is done between the parties? And there's a whole history on it.
We do have equity here too, by the way.
Oh, very good. Yeah, cool. I wasn't sure. Things like injunctions and you know yourself. Yeah. So you sit those, and they have a pass rate. I think at the moment, only about 30% of people who sit them pass it. People do eventually get there, but it's between I think 30 and 40% of people when they sit them, they actually pass. So then what happens is you then go to what's called the professional practice course, and that's divided up. So you have to do 6 months in the first part of the professional practice course, which again looks at things like ethics and how to maintain accounts, because again, you're dealing with clients' money and, basic principles of advocacy, that type of stuff. It's more professional. It's aimed towards the practical side. Because again, your students will probably know from doing an undergraduate, it's very academic. And certainly it is in Ireland as well. So it's trying to get you out of that mindset and looking at, well, what am I doing as a career? So you do that for 6 months, and then you're obliged to do a 6-month in-office training. So again, the idea being that you're in the office, you're doing kind of your practice area. And then once that's done, you go back again and you do a thing called the PPC 2 or the Professional Practice Course 2. And that's only 4 months long. And again, it's looking at more advanced areas. There are specialisms that you can choose once you're there. I suppose the biggest thing about it is that it is the biggest party you've ever seen. You have a lot of kids who have come straight out of college, who've studied hard, could be studying for 6 or 7 years, who now have a load of money because they've been working in the office, and there's a very good party attitude towards it. They're trying to professionalize it a bit more. There's still hard exams to pass, but there's a good party attitude, definitely, and it's like it is the last hurrah before you go into the world of work. And you can imagine, like, I've never worked in corporate or kind of commercial law, but you have kids coming out of there with significant amounts of cash because they're being paid real money. And it's debauchery, but it's good fun, right? So if anyone wants to come to Ireland, all you have to have is an undergrad degree. So the barristers are similar enough. So what they do is they again have to have an undergraduate degree in anything. They then have to pass a set of entrance exams. And once they pass those, they have either a 1-year full-time course or a 2-year part-time course, where again, they're very much focused on advocacy. That is all their training is, advocacy. And then I suppose in some ways, kind of the formal how to write a legal opinion and that type of work. That's how they do it. And then they qualify. So again, you're talking either route. Most people take the guts of 8 to 10 years, to qualify. A
Quick
lot of
follow-up
people will
question.
have masters, you know.
All right. Quick follow-up question for the barristers, the 1 to 2 year period of training. Do they actually get the opportunity to go argue in court, or do they kind of sit next to a barrister that's arguing in court?
Yeah, it's hours and hours of training, but they don't have standing in front of a court, so
Got
they
it.
won't actually. But they will do an awful lot of kind of informal training and moot court
Got
practice,
it.
and it's quite intense in some ways. But they also have this crazy thing that they inherited from the Brits, where to qualify they have to do 7 dinings, is what it's called. So it's a bit like Harry Potter, right? So they have to go and they have to be logged in to have 7 official sittings where you have a 5-course meal and there's, judges and
Sounds
elders
good to
sitting
me.
there. Yeah, it sounds great. It's very, kind of in this big long hall, and it's all, like nearly like ancient Victorian type tradition. But the bar is very much based on that, that is, I always find that a weird one when all my friends, and people that we would brief would say, oh, we have to go to a dining, and you're like, oh, what's that all about? But it's one of the nice things, and it's, they're very much based on, those historical things, whereas
Right.
the law study probably isn't as much. It's been kind of taken over by the commercial firms, and it's a bit more, modern, I suppose is the best way of putting it.
Okay.
It doesn't have the same great age luster that the barristers do,
Yeah, the United States, our profession is kind of also moving a little bit away from the pomp and circumstance of past and kind of, I guess, the formalities, the hierarchical type of aspect of it. And, I have mixed feelings about it. I understand, maybe some of that is outdated, but part of me also tends to think that some of that culture does engender kind of the mentor mentee type of, training environment that so many of us need, because what you learn in school academically, while it's valuable, does not do anything to prepare you to actually be in the trenches. So yeah, it seems to be a trend in legal systems. Last question about this point, and then we'll move on to immigration. Okay. So typically, let's say somebody goes all the way through from high school, they graduate high school 17, 18 years old. How old are they typically when they have the law license in hand, let's say as a solicitor, okay, and they have unfettered ability to take cases without being under the supervision of somebody else?
Yeah, so again, typical degree is 4 years. Some people do a master's, but most people don't, right? Well, that's a lie. People are starting to do them, but they're, let's assume that they aren't, right? So you're talking, you go to college at 17, you do 4 years on an undergrad, which brings you up to 21. You sit your entrance exams, and again, most people wouldn't sit 8 in one go. It's not really the done thing. You would generally split them into 4 and 4. That would be the usual. So you'd have a spring sitting and a winter sitting. It takes most people, like I got them first time. I sat all 8 actually. One of the few, very few of us do it anymore. But I was just in the mindset I was ready to go. Now, bear in mind, I had also been academically training, so I'm a bit of a different path to others. But a kid coming out, they'll do them. It'll take them maybe a year to a year and a half to do those, because you have to prep for them. You can't just go straight, really.
Right.
So that's 23, let's say. Then they'll do their PPC 1. So they'll get onto that when they're, let's say, 24. Do that 6 months in office. So that's 25. You could be 26, probably 27, before you're really qualified. And that'd be younger, like a lot of people are probably 27, 28.
Right. Yeah. So that sounds about right here in the United States. Typically, it's 18. If you go all the way straight through, you graduate high school at 18, 4 years of college to 22. If you go straight in, 3 years of college, you're 25 when you graduate. You're usually 25, 26 when you're licensed to practice. And that's straight through. Many people don't go straight through. I didn't go straight through. I had a period of working between undergraduate and law school. But okay, great. So that gives us a good idea. All right, let's talk about immigration. And you kind of already told us in the beginning that you got your start at the firm you're working at right now, right? So you started from the bottom. Now you're there, right?
I'm living the dream, baby. The American dream.
Exactly. So, what made you, first of all, take an interest in immigration law and want to pursue it?
Yeah, and again, look, I suppose I'm the son of immigrants. I'm a son of two immigrants. Very fortunate son of two immigrants. Now, if you go to Boston lately, I know probably not. It doesn't seem, everyone claims to be Irish, so
Right.
so maybe we weren't the pariahs, maybe. But I always liked that, and it was always, I suppose, a feature in the psyche that I was very interested in politics and human rights law as a college, or sorry, as a high school, student. Always loved it, was always interested in policy, really liked history, was very, very interested in history and politics. And I think that for me was the attraction. And really, I always wanted to work in this area. I literally went to a talk from the guy who's now the head principal in our firm. And when I heard him speak about the types of cases, I said, that's me. That's all I want to do. I had published in the area. I had done a little bit of academic work for, peer review journals and things of that nature. And just said, look, this is me. And if I have to get up at 6 a.m. and go in and work a 14-hour day, I'm going to do it. I think the ethic of an immigrant is something that I have to say, seeing it now and looking at the team that I've built, I think that's very hard to teach.
Wow.
I think it's very hard to teach, and it's something I've always tried to emulate. And I've always found that, particularly in the Irish system, there was always this narrative of, Schrodinger's immigrant, right? So they're either lazy and they're taking all of our social welfare, or they're taking all of our jobs, right? So this idea that, as I say, Schrodinger's immigrants, that really, the reality is that it's very different, that they're normal people who just want to get on in their lives, people who want to make headway. And to me, there was always just that social justice element to it. Then, of course, I do other areas of law where I work on behalf of marginalised, nomadic people, so the traveller people of Ireland. So they're a specific minority group who, again, would be nomadic and have access to service issues constantly. And then obviously I do a lot in childcare and the idea of dealing with vulnerable young adults and vulnerable young children. They're just areas that will always appeal to me. And I've always found, as I said, maybe it's the upbringing or maybe it's not. I've just always sided with the marginalised. I'm very blessed to do it and very fortunate to do it. It's not the most lucrative area. But I think you need to have a vocation to do this type of work. You're right. The same. I mean, I know you're the same. Looking at the work that you do, it's not because you're looking at the dollar. It couldn't be, because if you were, you'd be in, Wall Street somewhere, and that's not to denigrate the work that people in that area that are passionate about that type of work do. But it's not for me, and it never was.
Understood. Okay, great. So within Asylum, so you gave me a lot to unpack. What type of cases do you handle? I'm sorry, immigration law. Within immigration law, what type of cases do you handle? Do you handle all types of immigration cases?
I do, from top to the bottom. Absolutely. Okay. Don't like looking after the commercial and corporate side of things as much, but obviously the way I look at it is everyone is entitled to a service. Everyone is entitled to a good service. And that service, okay, while it obviously, affordability is important and I have to keep the lights on for the 6 people who work with me. At the same time, I don't get the same kick out of doing that type of work as the other types. So you mentioned, well, what do I do? So asylum work, I have quite a large international protection practice. So that's exactly things like the Afghan crisis at the moment, looking after Afghan clients, trying to get their families from Afghanistan here, okay, to try and get residence here. I love citizenship cases, so helping people get naturalized or apply for passports. And again, I think there's a massive affinity with the U.S., where we have, I think there's like 70 million people worldwide who are entitled to Irish passports in a country of 4 or 5 million. It's pretty crazy. But I've always loved that, and I've loved that diaspora. Again, probably coming from my background, love the idea of being able to, be there and to help those who are genuinely looking to get that service. I, of course, look after then all forms of residency. So things like, we're obviously a member of the European Union, which I'm sure your students know. So that means that people who want, let's say from France or from Spain, who want to come to Ireland and work and live, We look after them and their family members. We do, applications to allow them reside here based on their right to free movement, which is basically in European law you can move from country to country, but you can't necessarily bring your family members with you, so you have to make certain residence applications.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. You've said so many things that I want to follow up on. I got to get to them before I forget. And some of them are actually things I'm personally curious about, actually. So a couple things. First of all, there's some people in the, let's say, international migration space that are now looking at Ireland as being the most valuable citizenship since Brexit happened, because Ireland is not, because Irish passport holders are both a member of the EU, okay, and also simultaneously a member of the CTA, the Common Travel Area as well, right, which gives the rights of work and settlement in both mainland Europe and, let's say, basically, England and the other CTA countries. So my first question is, do you think, I'm going to ask you, do you think Ireland has a claim as possibly the most, and I know a lot of it is fact specific, case specific, but in general, if you have to say basically the citizenship that kind of gives the most right of settlement, most valuable right of settlement and work, do you think Ireland has a claim to that?
We're up there. We're definitely up there. Particularly with our special relationship with the U.S. I mean, that obviously, there's countries around the world. I mean, we've Joe Biden there now. I mean, I know people have different opinions, but I mean, he is his colours nailed to the mast. He's very proud of his heritage. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that's me digressing. Do I think it's powerful? Yes, I do. I think the one limit that we have in terms of accessibility is those who want to invest in Ireland. Okay, so when they come here and invest, a lot of them think they have automatic right to live in Portugal or Spain or France. And it doesn't happen like that, or the UK, because you have to have citizenship. So you're right. So is the citizenship valuable? Absolutely. It has access everywhere, and free reign to go to most of the free countries of the world. Where people often get confused is the difference between citizenship and residency. Right. So if you can only live in a country or you've only a residence permit, it doesn't quite grant you the same rights, as maybe if I decided that I was going to reside in Italy. Well, I can move all about the continent, and there's no problem with any of those things. Because of our border with the north of Ireland, and partition that I mentioned earlier, we have decided not to opt into what's called Schengen. Okay, so again, for your students, basically, if you come over to Europe and I love this, right? It's a typically American thing, right? You watch these American TV shows and they say, "Oh, I'm going to Europe for the summer." Okay, I'm going to travel around Europe, and Europe is huge. It varies massively, right? There's a big difference from Dublin versus sitting on a beach somewhere in Spain. So in terms of citizenship, yes, citizenship. I have to say it is unparalleled. I mean, I can't actually think of another passport that grants rights of access to the biggest market, one of the biggest trade blocs in the world, in the EU, free right of access to the UK, preferential treatment in terms of US immigration law, preferential treatment in terms of Asian law in most countries, in most of the developed countries, and again, visa-free travel to the likes of South America. So you can access a lot of places without having to apply for entry visas.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, the way I thought about it is, the European Union, let's say passports, were kind of on equal footing in the sense of the rights within the EU, because they had the work and right settlements all over, and then post Brexit, right? Ireland, in my opinion, kind of got its unique position as giving access to both the EU and then the CTA. Maybe the U.S. Sometimes I compare. I'm going to be interviewing Christian Nassim, the editor of Investment Migration Insider. And I'm going to ask him this question, but I'm not going to let him see this video first. The question is: the U.S. as a passport more valuable, or as an EU passport more valuable? Right? I don't know, but there's certainly both up there. Go ahead. Do you have something to add?
No, other than I'm going to say something, I suppose, a little controversial here, but it is true. I think if you're asking me if I was traveling on a US passport, because I do, obviously, when I come to visit the US, and or an Irish passport,
Right.
I get a lot more heat carrying an American passport. I get a hell of a lot more heat. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very unfair. I don't think it's an earned advantage, but when you're traveling to other countries, I think there's a certain perception. And again, I don't know where it's come from. The US has always treated me very well. It's easy to say as a citizen, but there's obviously this international perception. And as an Irish person, it's hilarious because we're always refused for English people. They always say, oh, you're from England or you're from Britain.
Right.
And there's an immediate assumption, particularly on the continent of Europe. Mm-hmm. And you go, no, I'm Irish. And it's like, oh, okay. So you're right. It's funny. It's just weird. It's a weird experience you can have having both. I certainly feel like I get treated better having a European passport for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I make no position on whether this is deserved or not, but certainly I believe that the difficulty traveling with the American passport is because of the perception of foreign interventionism, right? In many parts of the world, right, we're looked at as meddling, in places that we have no business meddling in. Whereas Ireland, I don't think anybody has any beef with Ireland, at least not outside of the UK area. So yeah. Okay, great. Let me ask you this. So Stephen, what I'd like to do in our class, we go through a typical family-based application, right? The example I like to use is a simple one. Okay, you're an American. You fall in love with a lady from another country. Okay, for example, you want to bring her here so that you can start your family with her. So I want to take that same type of structure and ask you about Ireland, and just give us a brief idea of how, let's say, an Irish lady falls in love with, let's say, I'm going to pick a country. Let's say a man from Colombia. Okay, how does she go about bringing over that person to Ireland to live his life?
Well, the same rule as, funny enough, as a US citizen. Okay, even though US citizens aren't visa required for up to 90 days coming here, it's the same. So Colombia, US, China, it doesn't matter. So what you need to prove, right, or what, there's no legislative guidance on this, but there is a policy document that the immigration authorities have to try and make this easier. Okay, so the first thing is we don't have pre-clearance. Okay, so we distinguish between, I've said in some ways, US versus Colombia, they're the same. There is a slight difference in that if you're Colombian, you have to apply for an entry visa, so a permission to actually come here. A US citizen, you don't have to apply from the US. You can come here and make the application once you're here. Now, that has pros and cons, because how do you know you're going to succeed before you've come? So we've called for pre-clearance because I know you guys in the States do it for everyone. And I think it's a much better way. Anyway, so you've asked me a very simple question, and I'll give you a simple answer. Okay, so there's a policy document that the Department of Justice over here produce. And they have guidelines, okay? But they're not strict guidelines. So the first thing to note about the policy document is that's all it is. It's a policy document. Mm-hmm. You can always argue discretion or humanitarian grounds. Okay, so again, let's say I'm an Irish citizen married to someone in Afghanistan and I want to bring them here. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be able to argue very strongly, well, look, there's a humanitarian need for me to bring them here. Forget about everything else in the policy document. Mm-hmm. Throw it out the window. But in a typical case, the first thing you need to prove is that your marriage is a genuine one and that it's durable. So there's no minimum time limit you have to be married, but you need to prove that it's a genuine marriage. And how you do that is things like, pictures, Facebook, WhatsApp, proof of travel between the two countries, very basic stuff, okay? But that's the first hurdle. You need to prove it's not a marriage of convenience. The second thing is that they impose a financial threshold. So what they say is, look, you can't be over here claiming social benefit or public assistance payments like jobs. We have a thing called job seekers allowance, okay, which basically means the state will pay you money if you're Social Security. I'm sure you have something similar in your state. Yep. I'm sure it varies from state to state, but you have a similar concept of Social Security. Mm-hmm. And what they say is, look, if you've claimed Social Security in the last 2 years, the presumption is, unless you're going to come out with something crazy, right, and show some real humanitarian connection or have some, alternative thing that's happened to you, that maybe you've won the lottery in the last year, or you've got a really good job, or you've qualified from school. You need to prove that you've earned €40,000 cumulative over the last 2 years. So that's the simple answer to the question. But as you can imagine, when you're dealing with policy documents that have discretion, that's what it is. If it lands on Johnny's desk who's looking at it today, he might say, look, yes, there are very, exceptional grounds. And the courts have also looked at this and they've intervened and they've said, well, look, you have to take a humanitarian view. You have to look at the rights to, private and family life. So even though you have this policy document which sets out tests, there is this large discretion. And I'm sure that's alien to American lawyers or to undergrads. I think you can have this scheme which says one thing, but it can be departed from so easily in some respects.
Right.
That's how it works.
Okay. And I'm sure there's a lot of underlying complexity for some of these requirements. You're giving us the very
absolutely, yeah. I'm giving you the basics of it. Yeah.
What are being a practicing lawyer there in the trenches? What are let's say one or two most common issues that actually come up in practice with people trying to petition for a spouse to come live over there?
The biggest thing is the finances. Okay. It always turns around finances. The other thing is inconsistencies in documents. So if you're applying from a third world country, it is very, very hard at times to get consistent documentation. I have a lot of clients, for example, from Pakistan, where they didn't even have a birth cert register up until the late 1970s. So, there's a lot of bribery, there's a lot of corruption in some countries, not Pakistan, by the way. Pakistan is actually really good in terms of getting documents, but other countries that don't have, maybe they don't meet Western standards in terms of getting documents, and you have to often go through an agent or an intermediary. That's often very difficult, and having to verify that, and then looking at what we would call country of origin information to petition the Irish government and say, well, hang on, the reason we don't have a birth certificate or a passport with biometric information is because as late as 2018, whatever country didn't do it, and here's the state practice, and we can prove that. So there, honestly, it is as simple as that when you talk about spouses. We've had some very good decisions. I know you know about them, Parviz, that I've been involved in, and I was lucky enough to take and be involved in, where we've clarified a lot of those rules. And we've been able to rely upon human rights, okay, as a basis to try and, mitigate some of the harshness of the rules that appear there. The case I'm thinking of is the Gorry decision. And again, I know you know about it because you're very interested and you read very widely across very many systems. Where we're arguing that, look, even if there is this financial test, you need to look at family links, you have to look at ties, you have to look at the strength of the relationship. And the problem with our system really is, and where the difficulty is that it is discretionary. There is a lot of discretion. And that is actually really hard because it's very hard to predict. You can say to someone, well, look, I give you a 95% chance of qualifying. Absolutely. But you're never 100% sure because there's that discretion there. And I was dealing with a Canadian lawyer actually recently in relation to a separation, and he used this very interesting phrase that you study about at undergraduate level, which is the idea of palm tree justice. This idea that, there's no such thing as fixed rules, that everything is flexible. And that can create uncertainty, and it can create an arbitrariness in a system. We got better by having a published guideline and being able to say, well, look, there has to be consistency, but there's always hard cases. There's a great documentary on Netflix, or a great movie about 9/11. It's one of your great lawyers from New York. And again, you see them tussling with that idea that, look, you can have a compensation scheme, but what about those hard cases? And that's what keeps you up at night. That's what makes you work hard to try and figure out those gaps.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, in our class, we discuss and we study discretion as well in U.S. Immigration law. One of our modules that we go over is DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That's basically a protection. It's a short-term immigration benefit. It's relief from deportation for people that were brought to the United States before the age of 16. And that is, in fact, a discretionary benefit. We do have a program with guidelines, right? It says, you have to have come here before you're 16. You have to, have graduated from high school or college. There's a few other requirements, but all of that is underpinned by an element of discretion. So if somebody, for example, if a DACA recipient commits a crime, that doesn't necessarily automatically disqualify them from DACA. They can still be what we call denied for discretion, right? Which means basically they're not automatically denied because of the crime, but the adjudicator has decided that they don't want to offer that benefit, the renewal of that benefit. So discretion does play a big role here. Perhaps from what I'm gathering from what you're saying, maybe it's a little bit more defined in the United States in the sense of, if we have a benefit in which discretion is a factor, it's oftentimes enumerated. Discretion is a factor here, okay, versus other benefits where, it may not be enumerated. But there's definitely a parallel there in the system. And, Stephen, here in the United States, because, we famously have three branches of government, right? Executive, which is the president, the legislative, which is our Congress, and then the judicial branch. In immigration, the legislative branch actually technically makes the laws, okay? But the executive has to enforce them. And the laws are so broad, there's so much complexity that in the execution of the laws, the executive has to make sub-regulations, which in themselves kind of bleed over to rulemaking, to lawmaking actually themselves, right? DACA, for example, is not something that was passed by Congress. That was an executive order from President Obama. So that's basically actually an enforcement priority. That's actually what DACA is. Even though it's viewed as giving like a benefit to those who receive it. It's actually saying we're going to exercise prosecutorial discretion to not remove these people because they're low priority for us. Okay, these are people who were not, they didn't have any say in being brought here. They have gotten an education. They haven't committed, any big crimes, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, beautiful. Thank you very much for that explanation. So I know, Stephen, you're very involved in Asylum and, a lot of, as you mentioned earlier, public interest. I want to ask you about, I know just today or yesterday, you were actually in Irish Parliament advocating for some rule changes, I believe, and informing the legislators about issues. I really want to hear about this. First of all, congratulations, and obviously that's great that you're doing that work. What's going on there? What's a big issue that you were in Parliament discussing?
Yeah, so I mean, again, very different from, and of course, I'm always keenly interested in what's going on in the U.S. without being fully informed. And of course, you do read from a European perspective. It's a very tainted narrative, kind of how ICE is operating or whatever the case may be. The next big controversy and what is Trump doing to keep all these Mexican immigrants and separating from their kids. You hear a very jaundiced view, but the reality of it is we feel, or what it feels like to me is we're like that guy in the glass house throwing a stone essentially. I mean, we have a system of what we call direct provision. So what's a controversy at the moment is when you come to the border. Okay, so I'm coming from Afghanistan. I've travelled in 6 different trucks to get to Calais in France, and then I've been smuggled aboard a ferry, and I arrive at Dublin port, and I claim asylum there. So what normally happens there is you are forced to go to what's called direct provision. Okay, and direct provision is basically a system where you're provided with very, very basic necessities. You're given €20 a week and you're told, go away. You're not given the right to work. You can get private rented accommodation, but how are you going to do that when you don't have a right to work and you don't have cash? What is going on in these direct provision centers, a bit like the carceral system in the U.S. or, in states, I think like Georgia, where you have for-profit prisons in Georgia. We have, I only use that as an example because I know, having dealt with some clients over there and trying to get them repatriated to Ireland, there's a lot of problems with the for-profit system there. There's a hell of a lot of problems with the for-profit accommodation system in Ireland, and that's where the controversy is coming, that if the system was meant to be quick, okay, we understand that it's a deterrent to people, that you can't just come in and start working and, living your life, which is crazy. I mean, I think you should be allowed, but I get the compromise with those maybe on the right of the spectrum who say, well, no, you're encouraging, illegal immigration. You're encouraging people to claim asylum, who are really, economic migrants. So this is used as a deterrent, and that was the idea, that you were put in some really horrible place, given very, very minimal rights, with the view to eventually being regularised and then getting put on the Irish housing list and getting, some form of normal existence. What has happened with direct provision in Ireland is, it's just been a disaster. And there's been massive human rights violations, in our view, with how that system is conducted. Again, we're not saying if it was a short-term measure, it's not nice, but you'd get over it. The point is that some people, because of the length of our immigration system, could be waiting in that system for 2, 3, 4 years. And really what we were discussing to the Parliament, or my role yesterday, was to look at, well, are there cost-effective tweaks that we can make to the system to make it easier and to ease the burden? And second of all, are there some basic human rights that should be granted based on the fact that we have this absolutely abhorrent system? So basically, I mean, I'm not really sure how it works for you guys in the States, but that is how it works over this side of the house. And it's as I say, I often feel when Western Europeans are commenting upon what's happening in the US, they often have to look at their own systems and really, we're not as bad as some other countries who actually detain people, like literally put them into a cage at the border before they process their case. I mean, we don't do that. I mean, and that's, look, fair enough. Right. But what we have is not an adequate alternative at all,
So with regards to the direct provision, is your thrust more to give them increased freedom during the period of direct provision, or on the flip side, say, hey, we need to shorten the process so that they're not in direct provision for as long? Or, for example, give them a work permit after 6 months or a year or something like that.
Yeah, so what we're saying is that there is legitimate, again, because what you have to bear in mind is, like, I obviously come from the left of the spectrum in terms of European law. People in this area, if you didn't, there'd be a problem, right? So that's, and on the record of saying it, like, whereas, often you find that there's compromise in Parliament in terms of policy decisions. You have people on the far right who are like, no, get them at the border and kick them out. We don't care. Or put them in a detention centre, put them behind bars and wait for their case to process. And then once they're in, well, no, don't give them the right to work. Right. And what we're calling for is a much fairer balance. And I think the balance is between both. It's saying, look, everyone can agree that direct provision is not good enough, right? That it's not a good system. And while people like me would be saying, no, right to housing straight away, and that's how you get integration. And once you have integration, then people, it's much better. There's a right to work. You find that narrative between those outsiders coming in tends to go. Education tends to improve. There's people like me who call for all of these services to be provided, at the start. Other people on the spectrum who are saying, well, no, keep direct provision, but keep things much shorter. And I think both policy solutions are fine, but I think if using direct provision as the norm is where the real problem is coming in. And it's, again, not treating people as people. It's treating people subhumanly. Again, I know when you always invoke Nazi Germany, you automatically lose a debate, as they say. Calling Hitler on something always, it's always a very bad comparison. But I don't see how it's any different leaving people in squalid conditions, and in conditions where their liberty, and they have to put their life on hold for a significant period of time. It's a version of apartheid,
Okay.
And it's as simple as that.
Got it. My last question about direct provision before we head down the home stretch here. Is there some sort of policy proposal or legislative proposal before Parliament right now pending that we could hear about, as having taken action in a couple months?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a paper called the White Paper on Direct Provision, which is what was at discussion yesterday. Okay. And that white paper is proposing that by 2023, that an alternative to this particular for-profit sector will be in being. The paper then details a lot of structural and procedural changes, which again we were arguing about yesterday. I was saying, well, you can't move on with a system if you have a backlog of, 3,000 or 4,000 people.
Right.
Doesn't sound like a lot in the US. It's a hell of a lot in Ireland.
Right.
So my point was, well, give people, if they've been waiting for 2 years, give them permission to remain and then start fresh, say on the 1st of January 2023. And of course, that's where the debate is, because a lot of people are saying, well, if you do that, if you bring a general amnesty in, it's going to cause problems. Mm-hmm. But that's what the white paper is. It's looking at those systematic changes and actually abolishing direct provision. Okay. And moving towards a non-profit system, and again, a system where we build more social housing, basically. So.
Okay, well, good luck on that. We'll be following that closely and, see what happens. Okay, one other last aspect about immigration law that I want to ask you about before we get to the lightning round of questions, is one that I think could possibly be of interest personally to some of our students, right? They say, at least here in the United States, we say Ireland's greatest export was or is Irishmen. So some absurd percentage of us, myself included, have partial or full Irish ancestry. So what I want to ask you about, and we've spoken about this previously, just very briefly, is Irish citizenship by descent, and then Irish citizenship by associations, which obviously sometimes gets confused with the two, but of course they're related but separate. And this is a practice that I happen to know you deal with, okay, along with the others. So, first question, Stephen, who is entitled to Irish citizenship by descent? Let's say in the United States. Anyway.
So grandparents, if you have a grandparent born on the island of Ireland, you're good. If you have a great grandparent born on the island of Ireland, you may be good, depending if your grandparent or your parent went and got Irish citizenship prior to you being born. You can keep going back. I mean, I've dealt with people who go back 7 or 8 generations or whatever, back to famine times pretty much in terms of birth here, but they would have done the right thing by getting their passports and keeping them up to date for years and years and years and years.
Right.
So that, look, in a nutshell, that is the simple rule. So grandparent, no problem. Great grandparent depends on what your grandparent or your parent did, and any further back will depend then on what the previous generation did.
So if somebody's of Irish ancestry and they want to investigate whether they may qualify for this, would the first step be to start getting birth certificates going back in the line?
That is literally part one. I mean, it's literally 101. And again, Americans, I love real Americans. As in, I have the passport, but, not really. And everyone gets so excited about, my great grandfather was from a field in the middle of this little rural village, which is like a townland in the middle of nowhere. At the real Ronald Reagan, when he came to Ireland, it was like that. He went to a place called Ballyporeen, which is like this tiny little village. And, I love the enthusiasm when they come. And then when you have to tell them, well, you don't really qualify by descent. Right. We have to do a different way, which you mentioned, Irish associations. They often get very disappointed, because everyone thinks that they're Irish, and it's the one good thing about the Patrick's Day stuff. It is, I find it hilarious as an outsider looking at this. Paddy Wackery is what we call it. People dressing up in green and going out in the beer. But everyone, and it's an honour. It is a privilege. Not everyone says they want to be British, for example, or that they want to be French or German.
Right.
It's really a universal thing with us, and it's a badge of honour in my view.
We have a massive affinity for Irish culture and ancestry in the United States, especially as in the Northeast. Boston's the epicenter, of course, but New York, Philadelphia, even stretching down the eastern seaboard, we just have so many people who either like Irish, culture, or they associate in some way, even if they've never been there. Last question about citizenship by descent before I ask you about citizenship by associations. So, if somebody has an Irish ancestor that was born in Ireland, that's further back than just the grandparent, they could still qualify by citizenship by descent if each individual was registered in the foreign birth registry along.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
That is exactly it. As long and it was done before birth. So it was done before you were actually born. Yeah.
Right. So if we look at it like a football, what we call a football, American football, in effect, if the Irish ancestry has to be passed along from one generation to the next, and the person has to have the person passing the football has to have been registered themselves before they pass it along to their next of kin, the next child. Is that a decent analogy?
That is a brilliant. That's exactly it. It's a bit like Derek Henry taking a hold of the football. He's a Tennessee Titans player. That's it. Once you have it and you hold it, that's it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, great. So let's just get into Irish citizenship by associations very briefly, because I know we could dive super deep on this. And if it was up to me, I'd have you on here for 4 hours. Irish citizenship by, I'm sorry, I said ancestry, by associations. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
The difference is you can go back a number of generations, but you're naturalizing. So we have a different process. We have people who are entitled by birthright. We say, let's say it was your great-great-grandfather who came from Kilchimock in County Mayo, and you want to get your passport. You are not entitled to it automatically by putting your name in a foreign birth register. You have to prove to the government, right? And you have to say, look, I go back a couple of generations, but at the end of the day, I'm as Irish as anyone because I wrote a book on Ireland. I lived here for 2 or 3 years. I feel like I'm Irish. I'm associated here with the GAA clubs in Ireland. And the minister has a discretion to decide, yes, that link is strong enough, or no, it's not. I know people who've gotten it without ever stepping foot here. Okay, so I mean, that is true. It does happen. But you generally have to say, well, look, I came here and I studied for a couple of years, or, you know, I fell in love with the country and I've visited here 40 million times. So that's kind of, you know, that's one way of doing it. It's a bit different to Portugal. So, like, I know in Italy. In Italy, they have descent going back as long as you want, as long as you can prove.
Right.
So you find that a lot of Brazilian applicants are able to qualify for Italian passports. They've never been to Italy in their life,
Right.
you know?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Argentines as well. Supposedly 50% of Argentines are of Italian stock. So that's a huge country there too. Okay. So you mentioned the minister. That's the Minister of Justice, correct? Right.
Minister for Justice. Yeah.
And we talked about this concept of discretion, right? Previously. So discretion is heavily involved in citizenship by associations cases. You got to show and prove that you kind of deserve to be Irish. You're very Irish, you know, and cross your fingers and hope that the minister agrees. Is that basically it?
That's you've got it in a nutshell. Simple as that.
Okay. Wonderful. Beautiful. So I'm sure there's probably going to be at least one person in my class who is interested and going to pursue this. So this will be good. Okay. So we're coming down the home stretch. We're actually on the home stretch. Okay. So I want to go to the lightning round of questions to get to know Stephen Kirwan right now. Are you ready?
Go for it.
Okay. Stephen, dogs or cats?
Dogs all day.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
Tea.
Okay. Netflix or cinema, pre-pandemic cinema?
Oh, pre-pandemic cinema all day long. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Croissant or bagel?
Bagel.
Okay. Favorite country to visit? And we're going to take away Ireland or the United States because you're citizens there.
Yeah, such a pity. I love Spain. I don't know what it is about it. I just love the south of Spain. Beautiful.
Wonderful. Favorite movie?
Oh, God. I'm going to be really stereotypical and say Shawshank. I mean, I know that's like, oh, my God, everyone has said it, but it's a classic. Goodfellas, Godfather, you know.
Nice. I'm with you on all of those. Last lightning round question, iPhone or Android?
iPhone. Although I wish Android. My iPhone is acting up at the moment, so.
Okay. Last question of the interview. As I mentioned before, we have every year students that are interested in either law school or even just immigration advocacy, whether it involves law school or not. What tips do you have, if any, for somebody who's considering pursuing either a legal career or not necessarily a legal career, but a career that's defending immigrants?
Yeah. What I would say is getting involved in non-governmental organizations. Your skills that you learn at undergrad level and as you are progressing up the chain, do not discount how valuable that is to those organizations. And do not discount how valuable that experience is. That will teach you the basics of advocacy. And I think it's very important that you do it. Never be ashamed to be politically active. I know, again, in America, it's very divided. There's a lot of division, but I think it's important that you are politically active because law is about politics. And politics is not necessarily about law, which is one of those weird things. But I would say for sure, I mean, they're very helpful tips for me as an activist. The other thing is publish as widely as you can. I know the peer-reviewed publication system in the US is a little harder, but stick at it. And stay involved in student organizations too. I mean, they're very powerful tools to have. And do you know what? The other thing I'd say, and the final thing I'll leave you on is, travel widely. You're in a privileged position to be studying a great discipline. And I find that is aided by not being stuck in your box. I find I've become a much better immigration lawyer by seeing different parts of the world and by meeting other people. And I think that makes me a better lawyer. I'm sure you agree, Parviz. I think it's important. I think we can be very myopic in our view, that we're stuck in our communities or a particular mode of thinking. I think it's important to look widely. And finally, in terms of your academic stuff, if you're doing law as a discipline, it's great. But do try and read into other disciplines, because it helps, and it helps your ability to think through complex problem solving. Things like, legal philosophy or, even language skills. I find it gives you a very different mode of looking at the world. I think it is important. That would be my advice.
Great tips for my class and for me personally. I'm taking notes here as well. So, Stephen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Parviz. Appreciate it.